Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. This is Martin Luther King's birth date, and we'll talk about him. Interesting person.
Yeah.
He's somebody that I often thought that it would have been sort of neat to know and see what kind of things we could agree on. He's obviously not a libertarian, but there are some overlappings on what he was doing and what we try to do too. Because I think the thing about Martin Luther King that I admired the most was he preached, civil disobedience, but totally nonviolent, and something that many people talk about, and might have been one of the reasons he got assassinated, was his very, very strong resistance to war, especially the Vietnam War. And there are some people who believe that might have had an effect on some people, and one of the reasons why he was assassinated. So he certainly was an interesting person, and right now it seems like what happens so often is people will pick and choose exactly what they liked about him, and also maybe even want to change his views. So I think that's sort of an interesting story.
Yeah, it is, and obviously great, very important historic civil rights leader, Nobel Peace Prize winner. But, I think you've written about it many times in several of your books, how you've been attracted to him as the champion of nonviolence and opposition to war, even when some of his own people around him were saying, back off on the anti-war stuff.
Yes, and he did cite Gandhi as an example, and he did, have resistance from various groups, but also from the people close to him. Other black groups actually opposed him. Malcolm X was one example, because they didn't believe in this tinkering around the edges, and this. The blacks have suffered so much. You don't do that. You become violent and you take over and you demand things. But that was totally rejected by Martin Luther King. And another reason people say, well, maybe that helped, bring the coalition together of those individuals that ended up having Martin Luther King assassinated.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking at it. There was a Detroit Free Press ran a piece recently talking about his April 4th, 1967 speech, where he explicitly opposed war, and specifically the war in Vietnam. And they pointed out, interestingly enough, even the New York Times did not like this tactic. The New York Times wrote, "The strategy of uniting the peace movement and the civil rights movement could very well be disastrous for both causes." Yeah,
and it looks like there's, the pro-war people were able to, really look after their own beliefs, and that's sort of the military-industrial complex. And that has been going on for a long time, probably all the way back to the beginning of the last century, that there was always this faction that thought American greatness depended on our force abroad and making excuses for it. But, the quote that has been used the most and associated with Martin Luther King is very interesting. And I find it interesting because people want to reevaluate it and redefine it, and these are the words. But the one had to do with, and it was at the major speech, at the mall. And Reverend King said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And I just can't see how anybody can, oppose that. But that if it's taken literally, which I believe he meant it literally, that this diminishes the argument for aggressive affirmative action. That not only should people be judged by their character alone, it would exclude affirmative action, because if all of a sudden you say, well, we have to adjust, even if it requires people who were not guilty of the abuse, 100 years later or something like this, all of a sudden we're going to punish somebody and give them special privileges. That's really where the division was. And some of the individuals say, well, he really didn't mean that, and we live in a different age now. So it reminds me of the argument about the Constitution. You have to have a flexible Constitution. Truths aren't, absolute, and you have to modify them. And they say, well, he never meant that. And that's a hard thing to swallow when the words are pretty blunt.
Yeah, and I think if anything, he was not afraid to say it like it is. We know he won the Nobel Peace Prize in '64, but something else happened in '64 was LBJ's passage of the Civil Rights Act, and that really brought the two of them together. They became, very friendly forces. Although he was never a political activist, but he sacrificed all of that, and he opposed LBJ in the war. And in '67, several speeches that he gave virulently opposing the war, and it destroyed his access to political power in Washington, his relationship with LBJ. So he wasn't afraid to sacrifice for what he thought was right.
That shows you how powerful the forces who promote war are, what they can do. And the other thing that works on the people who want to be pro-peace and nonviolent is this stigma attached to those individuals as being weak people. Yeah. And you have to be masculine and tough and mean and a warrior and this sort of thing. And that's been going on, I guess, throughout the ages. And King even argued the case that civil disobedience and the practice of nonviolence requires a certain amount of strength and conviction, and not many people get recognized for that. But weakness goes to the individuals who go along with the status quo, and that's what we saw almost all the time in Washington. We had a couple handfuls of individuals who weren't ready to just bow over to anything with status quo, either the status economic quo or the military-industrial complex or the partisanship. Yes, whatever I need to do. We don't want to rock the boat. But I think that he understood this, and that's why he was a very powerful individual and have an influence on it. And I think the other thing that it wasn't just that he was anti-war for sentimental reasons. He had some very strong moral arguments for this, and that makes people very nervous. They don't want to fight morality, but if it's just, they're confused, and they don't understand, and they don't know why we really need to have an empire, and this sort of argument they want to. But he was a man that would argue from the moral standpoint on why we don't need to be over there killing people. I mean, his statement about what to do, I think I could have used it during my campaign. Just come home. That's what he was saying. Just quit it and come home. Get out of Vietnam. Just think how many lives. And that was in, what year was that? That was in 60. That would have been right before, about 67 or so. Just when it was really getting moving. He probably, if they'd have listened to him then, there could have been 40, 50,000 Americans not killed by that. Of course, the libertarian position is none of them would have been killed because we wouldn't have been over there. But anyway, if they'd have listened to him then and they turned on him, and I think ultimately that was one of the reasons he was killed.
He also made another point that I remember you making in a slightly different way. You've pointed out that, if we stop our interventionist foreign policy, this huge batch of money that we'll save, some of that can be used to help people over here that have problems, that need help, and a lot of it can be used to pay. He pointed out that it costs $500,000 to kill one Viet Cong overseas, where we only spend $3.50 for each poor person in the U.S. And he said a lot of that goes to people who already have jobs administering these programs. So
and that's where we have the disagreements with the progressives, a good progressive, Dennis Kucinich. And we talked with him, and he's a good person. But we'd have a disagreement. He'd probably be more aggressive on the fund. But the one thing I had conceded, and I've said it many times, is that if you cut $50 billion out of fighting senseless wars, and you save a bunch of money and cut down the deficit, and you try to get more money back there, that you don't attack the people that we condition to be totally dependent. And I'd use the point, what should we do? Cut child health care before we cut the war? And you could do that if you were working your way out of it, which I've always argued they're not going to do it. They're going to keep doing this until the empire ends, until something like what happened to the Soviet Empire would happen. But there there is such a strong belief in empire, the necessity of it, and this feeling of strength and determination. And right now, I am not anticipating that in the near future that aggressive attitude about us being the kingpin is going to change. But why can't we be the kingpin on setting a good standard, a good example, and being rich and generous and sharing and this sort of thing, rather than thinking, well, we're going to share how great we are by spending more money on the military and subsidizing some special interests who just get richer and richer, building planes and weapons that aren't sometimes even meant to be used because they never work out. If we had a real war, we'd have a bunch of weapons that probably wouldn't work, or they'd be old-fashioned. We'd have a lot of aircraft carriers that could maybe get wiped off the map in about 10 minutes, and yet they keep building and building. So it makes no sense.
Well, he cuts through this whole phony machoism, I think, with one line from his April 30th, 1967 speech, where he says, "The day has passed for superficial patriotism." Yeah, and that's what these people are, the superficial patriots.
Yeah, and that's to put you on the guilt trip. You're not patriotic, you're not American, and you're not strong, and you're weak. And this was used against anybody who won't toe the line and say that, yes, we're sending you're not supporting the troops. Oh my goodness. Well, maybe it's a good way to support the troops by not putting them in harm's way for a fight that doesn't mean anything. And when we look at the last 15 years of the mess that we have created, we're not even supposed to say we created the mess. We didn't have anything to do with the mass migration in Europe, and we can criticize what's happening, but to say that it's all the Europeans' fault. No, it's the Americans combined with a European faction, the NATO people. Just think of right now. I had somebody the other day asked me, and they weren't interested in politics. They said, "Is it true that we're putting a lot of troops in Poland?"
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? Why don't you tell me, why are we doing this? Is that going to make us safer?
It may start another war before Obama's even out of office. But we talked about the Nobel Peace Prize, and unfortunately, it's been tarnished by the current outgoing president. But when he won it in '64. Martin Luther King viewed it as, quote, "a commission to work harder than I had worked before for the brotherhood of man," and I think he did become even stronger anti-war after he received that. And it's very sad when you think about President Obama. Every single year of his presidency was spent dropping bombs.
And he got worse, actually.
He got far worse.
I had a view of him, and he didn't have that much record on what he really would do on foreign policy, but my view was that he might not be too bad. But it turned out that as time went along, even right up to the end, these troops in Poland right now, that's of his doing, but no, it's NATO and this thing going on. But we have a few minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit about why he was assassinated. The literature out there, and even the King family, they're convinced that the government had something to do with it. But there's hints. I've read a lot about the Kennedys being assassinated, and there are a lot of details about exactly the maneuvering of the person who was going to get blamed, along with the CIA. I haven't read as much about Martin Luther King, but those who have and know a little bit about it, they claim very seriously that the CIA was involved, and maybe the FBI even more. The Memphis police were involved, and they had to set the stage for it so that the police backed off and maneuvered the events and have somebody captured and found guilty and this sort of thing. But they must have felt pretty darn strong that they had to assassinate him.
And I think much more is coming out about it. There's the letter, I think, in '65 that the FBI anonymously sent him, encouraging him to kill himself. And there were other things too. He was constantly under surveillance and knew that he was. And I think this, is sort of what we call gaslighting, where the secret agencies will do little things to people that they have under surveillance to sort of convince them that they're losing their mind. This happened to Ernest Hemingway, who was also suspected of being a communist like Martin Luther King was. They would do little things, and he kept saying, I'm being followed, they're after me, and everyone thought he was crazy, and they put him into the mental home, and it turns out it was all true.
Yeah.
So it looks like they were fooling with Martin Luther King in the same way.
You know, there was one story about the assassination I thought was interesting because they have the evidence that there was a FBI agent that was on the inside and spent time on a daily basis with Martin Luther King. And I think he was a photographer, Ernest Withers.
Yes.
And he was the one that. And then also there was an individual that said that, well, I was standing in such and such position, but I had to move at the precise time in order for them to have a clear shot. And he said this years afterwards. So the evidence is, I think, overwhelming. And even though the government wouldn't investigate it, of course, if they did, it would be just another cover-up. But the King family had some civil, trials on this, and they were found guilty on this. The people that were that there was a conspiracy to kill him. But this is, and just think of today. And I'm not going to talk about sides on the argument on the CIA and Trump right now, but it was almost like, what are they doing this for? Why would the CIA be so involved and particularly? And it's been way back. It wasn't just once or twice. It's constant, and that and the CIA, I think, is very, very deadly, and sometimes. I guess we shouldn't talk about it.
But it is sort of serious when he said over the weekend, the CIA director said that Trump better watch what he says.
Yeah, and that does sound like a threat. And it's almost like no matter how many times we have evidence of what they do, they will turn it around on a Trump in saying, how could he be so un-American? How can you reject this advice? What can you do if you don't listen to your CIA agents and our intelligence agency? Well, why should you listen to it if it might not be true? So, the ultimate resolution of what's going to happen with the CIA and what really is going on, I think it remains to be seen. But this whole idea that if you don't take advice from the CIA agents, which the evidence is out there, that they're not defendable. I don't see how they can do that.
Yeah, and look at someone like Martin Luther King, who was so unyielding in his opposition to war and what ultimately ends up.
Yes, it's a shame, but still, there will always be some like Martin Luther King and others that will stick to their guns and what they believe in and defend it on moral grounds. I think the strongest argument is morality, even though at one time on the floor of the House I used in debate that the weakest argument you can use on the House floor is the Constitution and morality. No, they're not interested in that. They're interested in looking at the list that would lie on the desk and say, these are the number of groups that want you to vote no. These are the lobbyists that wants a no vote or a yes vote. That was the only thing that persuaded so many of them. So, but the moral argument, no matter what it is, I think you can use the moral argument not only for peace and foreign policy, but on economic policy too. Even though there's a lot of well-intentioned people who believe in redistribution by government force is the only way you can help poor people, there are others like us who believe that really if you want to eradicate poverty and you look at the record, you find out that the moral argument of personal liberty will solve more problems than anything else. And as our Institute for Peace and Prosperity argues, that the more we use these moral arguments, the more likely is that we can contribute to promoting a society of peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.